Hello, welcome back. We're going to talk again about cost accounting. This week we are going to be covering fundamentals of cost, volume, profit analysis. I think this is going to be a very interesting chapter. There are quite a few things that you'll need to remember when going through this chapter. The first is don't be overwhelmed by the formulas that you'll see. They will make sense over time. So I would think to make good use of the exhibits and all of the examples that are in your textbooks to help you get through this chapter. But let's think about a real life situation as we're going through this. The first thing is learning objectives. When you're reading a chapter and you're doing the homework, you must consider the learning objectives. What is this chapter aiming to teach you or to help you understand? We're gonna figure out how to use cost volume analysis to make decisions, understand the effect of cost on the structure on decisions. We're going to use Excel to perform some analysis, and we're going to incorporate taxes and other types of different platforms into our CVP analysis, and also some assumptions and limitations. So what is it? It's going to be talking about how can we look at things in the form of the relationships. How are these relationships among cost and revenue and the volume of our profit of the organization and how it affects profit. So it's going to be a very, very interesting process. First, we want to start with the income statement. As you already know, revenues minus your expenses give you your profit. Now, and again, we're going to change some of the wording here, but essentially you'll be able to see why we're changing those words and how they're very similar to financial accounting. So our operating profit is going to be our revenues minus our expenses. Here we're saying costs. We're not saying expenses. Make that distinction. So our total revenue is going to be our selling price of our unit, and this is assuming that you have products for sale. Your selling price per your particular service could very well be the P in this case, by the units that are produced. So our TR, which is our total revenue, is the equivalent of our sales multiplied by the units that we produce. And these letters are very, very important to remember because you're going to see them used over and over again. So P times X, or P times X, or PX. So our total revenue is going to be our P times X. Very simple. Our cost is going to be our variable cost per unit times the units that we produce or the output. Adding to that our fixed cost. So total cost is variable cost times units, or V times X plus F. Now, again, these different equations are not hard. Actually, they're pretty simple. It's just a question of you reminding yourself, when I want to calculate my total cost, it includes my variable expenses and it includes my fixed expenses. And as we talked about before, fixed expenses do not change. Variable costs or variable expenses are going to change based on the amount of volume that we produce. So the more the volume we have, the more the cost is going to be. So that's very important to note. So what is our profit? Our profit is going to be our price minus our variable costs. Now taking that number and multiply by our units of output and subtract our fixed costs. And a contribution margin, again, it's a different word, but it's very similar to taking your sales minus your cost of goods sold, giving you a gross profit. This is pretty much the exact same thing. Our contribution margin is very, very similar to that. If you want to make a comparison between the two, contribution margin is the difference between our price and our variable costs. So whatever is left over to cover our fixed costs will provide us with our operating profit. So our contribution margin then, because our price per unit, subtracting our variable cost per unit, P minus V. And here is an income statement, really looking at it from the management accounting perspective, because you can see here with our normal income statement, you wouldn't see variable costs. You would basically see costs, and then you would see cost of goods sold or selling expenses, etc. Then you would get your gross profit. In this case, we're talking sales minus our variable costs gives us our contribution margin, and then we take our fixed costs to come up with our operating profit. So another calculation. Again, we're going to take our contribution margin and we're going to find out what that number is. And again, these calculations are pretty simple, but you're going to see in this course, I don't think the calculations are what's hard. I think it's the fact that there are so many of them. And what I would suggest when we're talking about calculations and having to remember formulas, taking a step back and thinking about what you're trying to calculate would really make it easier for you to remember which calculation or which formula that you'll need to get that answer. And here we are. We are going to determine what our break even in units. Well, most companies want to know this. Why? Break even is where you don't make a profit, but you don't lose any money. You essentially net out to zero. And why is that important? Well, when you're trying to determine at a level where you are not making money or not losing money, it becomes very important because that can help you set your goals or of how many units you want to create or to sell in a year. And then what will happen if you go below that? And you need to know what that number is so that you don't go below that, and you will obviously make a profit. So to calculate our break even in units, we're going to take our fixed costs, which we already know what they are, and our contribution margin by unit. And again, the contribution by unit is going to be our sales price by unit minus our variable cost by unit. That will be your contribution margin. Now remember, contribution margin is the difference between the sales minus the variable costs. So now with that in mind, you can compute your contribution margin ratio, and using that information, you can calculate your break even in dollars. Again, these calculations are intended to help you or the organization determine at what point will I lose money? At what point will I be not losing any money, but not earning any money either, or any profit? And that's a very important information. But what if you want a target amount of revenue? What if you want to say, I want my profit to be X amount of dollars? How do I calculate that? And so many questions can be answered. If I were to set a profit margin of $70,000, how many trips do I need to have in order to achieve that profit? And here's your calculation. Now, break even in units, here's your calculation, break even in dollars. What I would like to emphasize is what this information provides to the user, what it gives you, allows you to decide on whether to increase the volume or to decrease the volume, or what happens if the volume of sales does go down. At what point do you realize, okay, I'm going to have a loss here? So those kinds of things are quite important. So what we do is we want to understand how can we use cost volume profit analysis to analyze our costs. What's the relationship between our fixed costs and our variable costs in light of total costs, and also how we can I would say structure our costs in operating leverage. What can we leverage? How can we leverage our organization in such a way where we can better understand our profit in light of fixed costs as well as our variable costs? Again, operating leverage, and there are a lot of calculations. The most important thing is not memorizing the calculation, but understanding what that information provides you and what kind of questions it can answer. That's more important, because you can always look back and at your textbook and look at the actual formula to calculate it. But what you really need is to understand what that formula is, what the output gives you, and how to make a decision based on that. And that's more important than memorization. Again, we're looking at two different types of organizations side by side. And again, all about practice, all about using the formulas and understanding what the formulas mean. Now, again, using high-low would be a good way to kind of get an idea of an organization if they had a certain level of organizational profit margins or contribution margin. What would that look like? You're doing a lot of what if analysis, a lot of that, because you're trying to think, what if I had my contribution margin at 25%? What if I changed it to 50%? What would our profit look like? What would our income look like, and compare it? And again, it's all about trying to figure out what's best for the organization to guide your profitability levels and the type of work or the type of sales that you'll need, and also how you can control your variable costs, because obviously you can't do anything about fixed costs, but your variable costs and how those change based on the scenarios. And there is an area where you might not be losing money, but you're not earning as much. there is that margin of safety. It's a little bit over your break even. And it's really something that an organization would absolutely need to know, because we know what our break even point is, but what is that little area where it's kind of safe, where you won't lose any money and the sales won't decrease? That margin of safety is the excess of your actual sales over your break even. And that's very, very important information. Again, if you're talking about a Walmart of the world, Walmart wants to know for various products, what's their margin of safety? What's the level of sales where they are safe, where they can achieve a profit and they don't receive a loss, but it's over the break even. And that will help them determine whether or not that product is going to continue to be sold at that store or that location, or discontinue in the store. Or they can see whether or not a particular department needs to go, or we need to increase, or we need to find other ways, decrease prices, or whatever we need to do to bring up the sales. But that margin of safety is that really a little cushion where you're not quite in trouble, but if you go lower than that, you will be in trouble. Information that is very, very important for organizations. They need to be able to make some decisions, and they need to know it quickly. So using Excel to perform CVP analysis, sensitivity analysis, using scatter plots, using regression analysis, all of which use mathematics in order to estimate or to determine levels of relationship among variables, like the variables and fixed costs. And again, we want to know how many units we have to sell, what is our target. Again, these ratios or these formulas are not necessarily hard. What I would like for you to know is, if I were to ask you, how many units do we need to sell if I want to break even? How many units do we need to sell if I want to target profit? That will give you, I know how. I will use the break even with a target as a profit to determine how many units. So those kinds of thoughts processes will be important for you. If you were asked a question, which model, which formula would best answer that question is, I would think, the ideal situation. And again, here we're just looking at various questions that an organizational management accountant would probably ask and advise the leaders. If we know our contribution margin is, can we determine how many sales, how many excursions or wrapping trips that we need to have in order to attain a certain level of contribution margin, 25% or 75%? So, and again, depending on the question being asked or depending on the problem you're trying to solve for, one would suspect you will be better able to determine which ratio or which type of formula that you'll need to use to answer those type of questions. And again, we're using estimates, we're using models. Nothing is 100%. Actual will come in and really help you out here, but we're using a lot of analysis based on assumptions that we're making. So nothing's 100%, but it does give you some information to make some sound business decisions. And you can use the same formula based on multiple products. And a lot of organizations, particularly in the retail establishment, have hundreds of different products that they sell. And that the extension of the model really needs to consider more than one product line. And again, weighted average. And again, as I mentioned before, looking at these ratios and these formulas are going to be important, because it will give you an idea of the type of solution or the type of answer to a problem that an organization might have. And that's what will lead you to the various formulas that you'll need to use. If I want to know what my contribution margin by unit, do I want to know my break-even point in dollars, or do I need to know it in units, and those kinds of things. So I would say, more than knowing what the formula is, knowing what question is being asked, and understanding the formula sufficiently well to know which one to use in solving that problem. Memorization of the formula is not necessarily the issue here. It's more or less understanding what that particular formula gives you and applying it appropriately. So, assumptions. It's a very, very important tool, but it does rely heavily on the assumptions. And the assumptions have to be realistic. Assumptions have to be looked at and to see if they're reasonable and that they make sense. And obviously, as needed, you need to change those assumptions when more relevant information is provided to you. I would suggest in this chapter to not be overwhelmed by the number of formulas that you'll be using, but spend your time and your emphasis on using the formulas to answer specific questions. What formula will answer a specific question, and use that formula. Don't rely on rote memorization. Remind yourself that this is important to understand what the ratios are trying to convey to the user, what solution to a problem that particular ratio or formula provides that. And if you can think about it in that way, it will be easier to determine what formula you need to use for a particular problem that you have. I hope chapter 3 is not overwhelming to you. I suggest that you read over the chapter and highlight in summary form the various formulas that you'll need to compute various different problems like break even or contribution margin ratio or etc. And then understand what those ratios and what those formulas give you, and then start practicing using those tools in your homework. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll talk to you in the next video.